Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to be back at the McGill Summer School. I spoke here in 2003, and I suppose before I go on, I should apologise for the quality of my voice. It's a bit damaged, not by the bar last night. I was at the Munster hurling final in Thurles on Saturday night, and as a Waterford man, you know, what can I say? I had to get it in, okay. As I say, I spoke here at the McGill Summer School in 2003, and I was looking through what I said at that stage. Last night, somebody was berating me and berating economists over not calling anything right over the last decade. We never warned about the problems and so on, and we've heard it all. We heard an absolutely ridiculous attack, in my view, on the ESRI in recent times about their forecasting record. I think if anybody went back and read what the ESRI was saying over the years, the problem was nobody listened to them. Okay, so we need to be mindful of that. But I just read an extract from what I said back in 2003, and I think it resonates a little bit with what Ed Walsh said earlier on. The physical infrastructure is of third world quality and public transport is seriously deficient. Traffic congestion has become a nasty fact of life and a serious impediment to economic activity. Education facilities and class size are not exactly what one would expect in a modern developed economy. And as we were reminded once again in the early months of 2003, the health service is a shambles. We may be growth rich, but the quality of life has arguably deteriorated for many over the past decade. And I suppose my concern with Ireland over the last decade really is that our total focus as policymakers was on the quantity of what we were doing. Maximise employment, maximise economic activity. We never stood back, and well, very few people stood back and asked the question, what is the quality like? What is the sustainability like? You know, in the 5-year period to the first quarter of 2007, which really was the peak of employment here, over 60% of the jobs had been created in construction in the public sector, and most of the rest had been in retail and the financial services sector, all of it driven by construction activity and, of course, rampant public sector spending. I repeat a point a number of speakers have made. You know, the mantra of Brian Cowen and Charlie McCreevy as finance ministers, well, our attitude is if we have it, we'll spend it. If we don't have it, we won't spend it. If you ran a corner shop on that basis, you'd be out of business within 6 months. To run an economy on that basis is absolutely bizarre, and we are all now paying the price for that. So we need to make sure it never happens again. So I suppose, as I say, it's the quality and sustainability of what we're doing, in my view, we lost sight of. We need to start refocusing on it. Where is the Irish economy today? I'm sure we are all painfully aware, but just to give you some facts and figures, between the first quarter of 2008 and the first quarter of 2010, our national output fell by over 16%. And what that means, in effect, is that for every €100 in circulation 2 years ago, there's now 84 euro or thereabouts in circulation. That's a massive amount of money to be taken out of an economy over a 2-year period. So that's what we're living with at the moment. A lot of people criticise people who engage in what they call the blame game. I think it's very important to engage in the blame game because I think it's vitally important to understand the mistakes we've made, who were responsible for those mistakes, and make sure that those people are not in a position to make the same mistakes again, or that the same mistakes are never made again. So we really, really need an understanding, and I don't think we are there yet, actually. I think it's an ongoing process, but we need to get there. I think we also need to distinguish, what has happened here since 1996. People talk about the Celtic Tiger. The Celtic Tiger was really the period between 1996 and 2002. It was a period where we saw huge levels of foreign direct investment into the economy, where we saw growth of over 14% per annum in exports, So as a small open economy, we were being driven strongly by the export sector, and that export sector was actually supporting the rest of the indigenous or the domestic economy. And I think that was a very, very good period. The period from 2002 to 2007 was a period that was driven by this belief that we actually had become a self-sustaining economy, that by building houses for each other and that by buying goods and services for each other, we could actually sustain our economy. The town close to where I come from, Dungarvan, during the peak of the madness, thousands of Eastern European workers were being brought in to work in the construction industry. They were building houses which they were renting themselves. I mean, is that a sustainable economic model? It was absolute nuts. It was madness. But that was the post-Celtic Tiger period. I remember in early 2006 being on a radio show, Matt Cooper's Today FM programme, with the chief economist from NCB Stockbrokers. They had brought out a report that day, arguing that exports were no longer important, that because of our demographic structure, the whole supply-side argument, Ireland could sustain strong growth forever. So issues like competitiveness, not important. As long as we had the demographic structure coming through, we were fine. I vehemently disagreed then. I disagree even more vehemently at this stage. But that was this post-Celtic Tiger period. And I suppose the other feature of Ireland over the last decade that I think we need to be very clear about, that was the whole membership of the single European currency. Gareth Fitzgerald mentioned it last night in his presentation. But I worked in Bank of Ireland in the late 90s, and I argued that Ireland would be mad to go into the single currency, and I eventually virtually got sacked for my pains. But I argued Ireland would be mad because I did not believe Fianna Fáil would be capable of managing an economy in a monetary union. And a lot of that belief was driven by a lot of analysis I did on the 77 manifesto, for example, which sowed the seeds for the ruin which we had in the 80s. So I just didn't believe Fianna Fáil would be capable of managing an economy. And I was even on a radio show on RT a couple of weeks ago with Senator Mark McSharry, who was arguing, well, Ireland's big problem was that we lost control of our interest rates. So what could we do? We couldn't control our economy. They forgot the fact that there is another policy called fiscal policy. You control taxation, you control spending. We abjectly failed to do that. And the whole McCreevy-Cowan mantra, if we have it, we'll spend it, that sort of typifies the financial management of Ireland in a monetary union. So, we need to get very real about that. We have, in my view, failed as members of the single currency. And if you look at, and I'll get back to the demented bond markets in a few minutes, but if you look at what the bond markets are telling us at the moment, they're pretty much saying that, and across Europe, it's not just Ireland, that the whole monetary union, EMU, is not working very well because it's fundamentally flawed. The structures governing it are not right. You need a much higher level of political control from the centre and fiscal control for the centre to make it work. And that is extremely unpalatable for national governments, but that's a totally different issue. The Irish economy, I take it through the two periods, Celtic Tiger, 96-2002, the post-Celtic Tiger madness period, 2002-2007, thereabouts. Then 2008, as an economy, we fell off a cliff. And I have many things in my life I regret, many things embarrass me. But I think the thing that stands out most of 9 years with Bank of Ireland ranks up there pretty highly, but that's beside the point. The thing that embarrasses me most of all, I went on prime time in, I think it was February 2007, with Morgan Kelly in UCD. And I was pretty sceptical about Ireland, I was pretty negative about Ireland, but I sat in front of, in a studio, somebody who was off the radar in terms of negativity. And I came across as being an extreme optimist, which I certainly wasn't. But I thought Morgan was off the wall at that stage. And I apologised to him on the irisheconomy.ie website quite recently because he was 100% correct, I was 100% incorrect. But it was, if somebody had told me at that stage, early 2007, that what was going to happen to the Irish economy and the Irish banking system, Irish house prices, was going to happen. I just wouldn't have believed him. But what we were seeing in 2007 into 2008 was the internal bubble was bursting. An economy that had become totally and inordinately over-dependent on the construction sector finally imploded. Over 20% of our GDP came from the construction sector, 14.5% of our employment from the construction sector. Our equity market, dominated by the banks, was being driven by the property sector. And just overall, tax revenues, of course, were being driven by transactions in the construction sector. So as an economy, we had become totally and inordinately overly dependent. We'd become a bird flying on one wing. Unfortunately, I did not envisage the extent to which that wing would get damaged, but it has been cut off. The economy has collapsed, and that's what we're now living through. And of course, we were hit by an external shock in the summer of 2008, which really exacerbated the problem. So any possibility there was of a soft landing for the economy was blown out of the water at that stage. Today, we have almost 453,000 people on the live register. That's absolutely massive. John mentioned that unemployment in the 80s was higher than it is today. But I actually think the labour market situation is much worse today than in the 80s. Because back in the 80s, we had very low levels of expectation. We had very low levels of personal sector debt. We had strong outward migration, and people accepted that as a fact of life. Today, we have huge levels of personal debt. We have a huge level of expectation about what life owes us. So I think this adjustment that we're in the midst of in the labour market is much, much more painful than it was back in the 1980s. So I think, we need to be careful about that. We've lost almost 267,000 jobs in the economy over the last 2 years. 76% of those jobs have been male. So there's a massive male unemployment problem in the economy. And, and it's across all age profiles. It's not just the young, it's across the spectrum. So I think that is a serious social issue. I'm not suggesting that if it was 76% female, it would be any less serious, but 76% of the unemployment within the male category is a pretty serious indictment. We have a massive hole in our public finances, as we know. Credit has collapsed in the economy, and despite the palaver that comes from the banking sector, credit is not flowing in the economy. It is not available. That is a fact of life. And I suppose, unlike most of my colleagues in I was going to say the economics profession, but that might be an oxymoron, in the economics business, I tend to get out of Dublin a lot. I go around the country, I talk to SMEs, and I just get a picture out there at the moment that thousands of small companies are hanging on by a thread. They've cut back dramatically. Most of them aren't even taking salaries out at this stage. And if credit does not start to flow into that sector of the economy, rural towns around the country are going to be decimated over the next couple of years. The banking sector is in a serious mess. I have no idea the extent of that mess, because everything we've been told from the banking sector to date has been blatant lies. So I really am not sure, and I think even the biggest banking experts such as Morgan Kelly, particularly Carl Whelan in UCD, are still not certain about the magnitude of the problem in the banking sector, but it certainly does worry me. We're seeing pretty significant levels of outward migration again. So, in other words, we're starting to do what we did very well in the 80s. We're starting to export our brightest and best people from the country. And more than anything else, that, in my view, was the most negative factor in Ireland in the 80s. And it would be absolutely dreadful to see our brightest and best young people being forced to leave the country, brain drain, involuntary. It's an absolute disaster. I suppose the final point before I move on to the steps to recovery, we've seen a little bit of argument in recent weeks amongst economists about the exact status of the economy. We have technically emerged from recession in the sense that GDP in the first quarter of this year was 2.7% higher than the final quarter of last year. So that technically qualifies as coming out of recession, I think. But GNP, which I think is a better measure of what's happening on the ground, actually contracted again in the first quarter. So what we're seeing really is an economic recovery that's been driven primarily by the multinational export side of the economy. It's the IT and chemical and pharmaceutical industries. We're seeing some pick-up in parts of the indigenous exporting base, particularly on the food side, having fallen off a cliff last year. But the recovery is being driven by primarily the multinational export side. It is not going to result in job creation. It is not going to result in tax revenue buoyancy. To achieve those two objectives, you need to see domestic demand picking up. You need to see consumers starting to spend. And there are very high levels of personal savings out there in the system at the moment, but people lack the confidence to spend. We also need to see businesses starting to invest again. We're not there yet. And I suppose provided we do the right things, we can get there over the next couple of years. The key issues for me, one, the negative fallout from the housing adjustment, is ongoing. We have experienced one of the biggest ever collapses in the construction sector in any developed economy ever. 93,000 houses built here in 2006, which was madness, but that was the figure. This year we're likely to complete around 10,000 houses. For every 10,000 houses less you build, it takes about 1.2% off the economic growth rate. So we're going through this massive housing adjustment, incredibly painful, and until it stops collapsing, we're going to have to continue to work through the problems associated with that. That's one big issue. The second issue, government debt and borrowing, growing very, very rapidly. Third issue, personal debt, serious issue. There's debate going on at the moment about what one should do to help people in a negative equity situation in the mortgage market. And it's an incredibly complicated question to answer, because who do you bail out? Who do you help? There's the whole issue of moral hazard. Very, very difficult question to answer. But the economic fact is, if you have 300,000 people, which I think we will at the end of this year, in a negative equity situation, you have 300,000 people going around. Okay, negative equity doesn't become a real issue until you lose your job and are not able to service your mortgage. But there is a broader economic issue. If you have 300,000 people going around with a mortgage significantly higher than the value of their property, it has a huge impact on their spending behaviour, and it has a huge impact on economic activity. So it's an issue we are going to have to sort out in a much more meaningful way than the expert committee has recently suggested. The banking system, obviously in a serious mess. It needs to be sorted out. Competitiveness, and I'll talk about competitiveness in a second, I think it is vitally important. Our foreign direct investment model is seriously flawed at this stage. And I think we have to recognise that gone are the days when we're going to see companies coming into towns setting up 2,000 or 3,000 jobs. The future for foreign direct investment is the creation of 100 or 200 jobs here and there, spread out over a couple of years. So I think to believe that we can drive the Irish economy into the future based on inflows of foreign direct investment is very, very naive in my view. And the final big issue is the issue of leadership. I could talk for another hour on the issue of leadership. I won't. But I think suffice to say, our leaders have left us down very, very badly in this country over the last decade. The political leadership, in my view, has been absolutely dire. I think elements of the business leadership has been dire, particularly out of the banking sector. I think the public sector leadership has been dreadful. And perhaps the political system and how it interacts with the public sector is part of the reason for that. But, the Department of Finance hasn't exactly covered itself in glory over the last 4 or 5 years. And a little bit like Eddie, I dared criticise the Department of Finance 18 months ago, and they made a formal complaint to my employer and tried to get me sacked. So, you dare not criticise the Department of Finance, but I do think the leadership we've got from the public sector has been very, very bad. The Church, of course, has provided no leadership whatsoever. And even in the last couple of weeks, we've seen one of our great organisations, the GAA, that actually doesn't deserve the players that play for it. The leadership there, and I've had my own personal experience that I won't bore you with, but I had an experience with GAA recently, my 12-year-old son, and it just left me with the deepest sense of the lack of integrity within that organisation. And I think it's spread across Irish society. So I'm not sure, are we a society that actually has no integrity? Is there any honesty here? I don't think there is, to be honest. So, but there you are. Okay, I will conclude by going through quickly, I think my time is probably up, Chairman. I will go through quickly the key steps that need to be taken, in my view, to get the economy back on track. The public finances have got to be sorted out, because people argue we should not be beholden to bond markets, and in an ideal world we shouldn't. It would be great if we weren't. But a country that borrowed 25 billion last year, that's going to borrow around 20 billion this year, the reality is you have to go to bond markets to raise money. At the moment, we are paying about 270 basis points over Germany to borrow money. In a monetary union, that differential should be no more than 20-30 basis points. So that means that we have absolutely no choice other than to continue to press ahead with cutting spending, increasing the tax burden. If we don't do that, if we see any signs whatsoever of reversing course, we will become Greece overnight, and the Greeks are currently paying about 9% over Germany. We just can't go there. We need to fundamentally reform our whole public finances. You know, the base from which we collect taxes has been allowed to narrow way too much. If you go back over budget speeches, McCreevy, Cowan, we've taken another 30, 40, 50,000 people out of the tax net. We are now in a situation where half the workforce does not pay income tax. That is an unsustainable situation. We had the rest of the tax system was based on transactions in the property sector mainly. That's collapsed. It ain't coming back. So we are going to have to seriously look at broadening the tax base. Property tax, water charges, bringing more low-income workers back into the tax net, getting rid of many of the tax allowances that are in place. It's an inevitable part of our fiscal future. But also, we are going to have to bring public spending down. There is no doubt about that, because at the moment we have one of the most favourable dependency rates in the world, in the sense that the number of people at work have so few people out of work to support. Because of our demographic structure, that's going to change dramatically over the next 30 years. And unless we have a tax base that is permanent and constant and a low spending base, we're not going to be able to fund that into the future. The banking system needs to be seriously reformed, because we need to get credit flowing in the economy again. We're going through that process. I'm not going to pass comment on NAM or whether it's good, bad or indifferent. We're going through that process. But I think the more fundamental question is, what sort of banking sector should we have when we come out of this? The banking sector in this country came to believe that it was a wealth creator in its own right rather than a wealth facilitator. That's not how I see a banking system. I see a banking system as an intermediary that takes money from people who want to save and channels it to people who want to borrow. And that's what keeps commercial activity going in the economy. Should we recreate a banking system that is run by the same people, which is the case, but that is also run on the basis of profit maximisation at all costs? By definition, the more profits the banks extract out of the economy, the more business people they're screwing in the economy. So I really think we need to fundamentally reform the whole profit maximisation model. If somebody had suggested to me 10 years ago that I'd stand up and suggest something like this, I'd have confined him to an institution, and it wouldn't be a bank. But, we've had a serious market failure, and we really need to re-engineer it properly. Competitiveness. We just have to get the whole cost base of the Irish economy down. Everything. Consumer prices, professional fees, local authority charges, commercial rates, commercial rents, IT, you name it. And unfortunately, here we go again. the National Competitiveness Council over the last 6 or 7 years and go on the website, look at the various reports that were published, year after year, they pointed out exactly the trends in competitiveness, where we were relative to our major partners. We did absolutely nothing about it. We just ignored it. Most of those reports went into the recycling bin in government buildings. So we really have got to get real about competitiveness, because we've got to re-engineer the export base of the economy. We have got to restore our reputation. Trust, integrity are gone, as far as I see it, in many aspects of Irish life. And for a big economy like the United States, you can actually get away with it. But for a small economy like Ireland that is so dependent on investment into the country from overseas, reputation, integrity, trust is extremely important. And I suppose, some things do give me cause for hope in this regard. The changes we've seen in financial regulation, for example, but there is a long, long way to go. The quality of the labour force, this goes back to the point about education. I don't believe Ireland has a top quality education system. I teach in it, I'm on a few boards of management in primary and secondary schools, and I'd have serious problems about the quality of education here. We need to, if we don't have the quality of labour force, we're going absolutely nowhere. So human capital, absolutely vital. The final thing is the diversified economic offering. I'd be slightly old-fashioned in this regard. I believe foreign direct investment, the whole research and development agenda, moving up the value chain, that's all very important. But I also think it's important to nurture what we would regard as the older industries. I would be a champion of the agri-food industry, for example. I'm chairman of Love Irish Food, and I don't get paid for the privilege, so it's passion on my part. Tourism, the potential has to be huge, which we don't exploit properly. The arts, we are really good at the arts. We don't exploit it enough, in my view. The thoroughbred industry, I think the arts and the thoroughbred industry are probably the two areas where Ireland actually is world class. And where we are world class, we need to focus in there. Service exports, education, for example, as a service export. Is there any reason, and I'd be interested in listening to Ed Walsh's response to this, is there any reason why Ireland couldn't create a Harvard University? Money. Presumably that can be sorted. Well, maybe. But yes, okay. Okay, so that's all I want to say. What we really need to think about in this country into the future is the quality and sustainability of what we do, and not the quantity. We just have to get real. We have got to create a sustainable economic model, and we never again can allow the sort of mess develop that has developed here over the last 10 years, and leadership is vitally, vitally important in that regard. So thank you very much for listening to me.